everyone, my name is Yuliia and you are watching Multicultural's Community Hour. In this segment, we are talking about civic issues in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I would like to introduce my guest, Shayna Plaut. She is a critical researcher and instructor in human rights and social justice throughout Canada, the United States, and Europe. She has worked for Amnesty International and Amnesty International USA and a Research Global Reporting Center. Currently, Shayna is a director for the Center for Social Science Research and Policy at U of M. Hello, Shayna. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it, Yuliia.
And first of all, can you please tell us more about the work you do and the projects you are running?
Sure. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that I was not born in Canada. So I emigrated to Canada 13 and a half years ago. When I first came to the unceded lands in Vancouver, so there were no treaties, of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And now I'm here in Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Métis Nation. And that's very important to me in the work that I do because I work regarding human rights. Human rights is a very broad topic. Specifically, I work in terms of human rights and its relationship with media and how people who don't fit in well with the nation-state framework, how they present their own advocacy, their own rights claims, often through their own media or their own advocacy strategies. I also do work academically and professionally in terms of the methods and the ethics when you're doing human rights work or when you're doing social science research more broadly, hence serving as the director for the Center for Social Science Research and Policy at the University of Manitoba. So the work that I do academically is a bit in terms of how people frame their human rights causes, claims, strategies, how they use their own media, similarly to what you're doing here, and then also how they make their messages most effective depending on the different audiences. But then we also do work with clients to help them in their own research work.
So human rights is a very large definition, but the simplest definition is that it is the basic rights and freedoms that belong to every person in the world. But I'm curious if you, as a researcher, have your own definition. So what does human rights mean to you?
Sure. So when I'm teaching, one of the things that I always get my students, and I primarily teach at the university and graduate level, but I also train university and graduate students how to teach in the secondary school level. So when I'm teaching, I always have my students define what does it mean to be human? And then I have my students define what does it mean to be right? You know, what is a right? And I don't mean the opposite of left, but what is a right? So what is a human? What is a right? And then one of the things we do is we work through the idea that human rights enable people to actually enact their humanity. So human rights are the things that allow a human to actually be human, to enjoy the rights and the responsibilities and the dignity of what it means to actually be human. They're the things that both protect you. They're the responsibilities that you need to put forward. They are the privileges that might be taken away, right? So what, you know, human rights are they're not just laws, right? They're not just edicts, but it's actually also the social fabric, the cultural fabric, the economic structures, the institutions that enable you to live a life of dignity and to be human in the way that you can go through in the world. Being very clear to understand that in the West, we tend to think of human as an individual, human as one person. This is actually an anomaly. Most of the world will say that to be human is beyond that of just the individual self, but is your family, is your land, is your past, is your present, and is your future, right? But that the humanness is beyond that of the individual. So many people will criticize human rights by saying that it's a Western concept. In the way that it has been codified or in the way that it has been put forward through the United Nations, yes, It has been very much led by the West, by the global North, and there has been a lot of consequences. But human rights first started off with the Hammurabi Code in what is now modern-day Iraq. Human rights did not come from the West, and human rights are not the purview of the West. Human rights have been co-opted in some ways by Western capitalist countries, but actually all cultures have an understanding of human rights and have an understanding of dignity and the rights and the responsibilities that come with that.
Shayna, what Canada is doing for human rights and what impact does it have on other countries across the world?
Sure. I would say that Canada has for a while now understood the relationship between development and human rights much better than other countries. So when it's going forward in terms of doing international development work, it does and it has integrated certain human rights practices and in its development work. In that way, I would say Canada, I wouldn't say it's a pioneer, but it's good. And the other thing that I would say is that Canada is in a position right now where it's really recognizing the grave human rights abuses that take place in terms of Indigenous peoples here, and is really struggling but taking steps to recognize Indigenous rights and human rights. And I would say that it is in some ways very much one of the leaders in recognizing that you can't just talk about human rights over there. You have to also be talking about what's happening in your own country. And in your own country, here in Canada, it's very much in terms of the ongoing human rights abuses with Indigenous peoples, as well as reconciling what's happened in the past.
And where do things stand in terms of respecting human rights in Winnipeg, in Manitoba?
It's a good question, Yuliia. You know, I chose to move to Winnipeg 5.5 years ago. Previously I lived in beautiful British Columbia, excellent sushi, beautiful mountains, but I chose to move to Winnipeg. And one of the reasons I chose to move to Winnipeg is that people here, they have dirt under their fingernails. They know how to work. It is one of the most racist and classist cities in Canada that I've been to, but you also have people who really know that that's going on and are working in order to fight to make it better. It has some of the strongest refugee-led and immigrant-led organizations that are working on refugee and immigrant issues. So it's not just in terms of charity or being benevolent to the stranger, but actually refugees and immigrants themselves working to make things better, and also in terms of Indigenous-led organizations. So in that sense, I would say that Winnipeg has some of the gravest human rights violations happening, but also some of the strongest advocacy. I live in West Broadway. All of the situations that are going on in terms of the bus shelters, and I take the bus often, and people living in the bus shelters because they have no place to live that they feel safe, that's on my street. I walk down the street with my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old.
What can we do to change the situation?
I think that Winnipeg has the tools. I mean, if we look at the history of Winnipeg, it's one of the strongest leaders in terms of labor rights movement, in terms of recognizing economic rights as human rights. We need to remember that, right? I think it's one of the strongest places in terms of, again, immigrant and refugee-led social change. We need to remember that. So what can we do? We need to listen to people who are affected by these grave human rights abuses, and we need to listen to what they're saying are some of the solutions. And most of the time, it's going to come down to basic human rights and dignity: food, shelter, heat, education, feeling safe, not having racism. When people feel safe, then people can start thinking about broader ideas of human rights. But if people aren't feeling safe and if people are feeling desperate, then there often are going to be human rights abuses that are taking place amongst each other or with others because people want to live and people want to live with dignity.
You worked in Europe for a long time and used to work for Amnesty International USA. What can we learn from other countries to enhance programs that protected our human rights? And if we compare the programming of European program and Canadian program, what can we learn?
Yeah, I mean, I lived and I worked in Central and Eastern Europe especially, so Hungary and also former Yugoslavia, Macedonia especially, and I've spent time in other parts of Europe. One of the things that I would say that Canada has as an advantage over Europe is that Canada it's a settler country. It's a country formed on colonialism. There's no question about that. But it's also a citizenship-based country. So you can become Canadian. I have become Canadian. My children were born here, so they are Canadian, but I have become Canadian. And there is an understanding that being a refugee or being an immigrant is not a bad thing. It's not a dirty thing. But rather it actually could be seen as an advantage and as something that it can enhance and build the country. I think that's something that Canada can actually teach Europe, because the nationalism in Europe, the idea that who you are is based on your blood, that desire that there's something fundamental in your nationhood that's going to be your character, and that you can, that I think is actually very, very dangerous. And the increasing in nationalism that we've seen throughout all of Europe. We like to blame Central and Eastern Europe. No. UK is sending people to Rwanda if they're seeking safety. I mean, really? So that increase in nationalism is very troubling. And we have it here too. We have it here in Canada as well. And we have it in the US. So what can we learn from Europe? I think we can learn about social safety nets. But I think we need to remember that extends to all people. So Europe needs to learn that you can't be stigmatizing people for exercising their right to safety. That it is fundamentally a part of international human rights, and that when you're going to be signing something like the European Union, right, and you have regulations about tomatoes and how big a tomato can be, you should also have a common regulation about what it means to exercise human rights for people who are seeking safety. What are the basic things that refugees need or people seeking refugee status need? That's something that I think that Europe needs to learn. What I would say that Europe does well is that it does pay people to be able to learn the language and to be able to do that. So you don't have to try and survive while also trying to learn language. What it doesn't do well is it doesn't give people a work permit automatically. And that's something that Canada does do. If you're accepted as a refugee, it does. But even if you're a refugee applicant, you can work. You can feed your family.
Based on your observation, are all people here treated equally in Canada? If we compare people who were born here and new immigrants, are all people treated equally, or there are some?
Of course not.
Not.
Of course not. No, racism
Why?
is alive and well. Racism is alive and well in Canada. And one of the things is that, Canada still does not know how to really show respect to the first peoples of this land. When I emigrated to Canada, I sought permission to emigrate from the Queen. I didn't seek permission to emigrate from the first people of the land, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish, because I was in BC. I went to the government of Canada to ask permission, and then, in the end, it ended up becoming the Queen, because the Queen is the head of state. Okay, now it's the King. At the time, it was the Queen. So fundamentally, that's not treating equally. But if we also look, racism is here. I've had experiences in terms of how my students have been treated, or people that I was working with, because I said, like, there's going to be some East African folks who are going to be coming for interviews. If they look lost, please send them to me. And the response from the security guard was, sure, as long as they're not known gang members. I was like, wait, what? I'm telling you that I got some folks who are coming for interviews. Why are you associating the fact that they're East African with being gang members, right? That's just an example. These were students, you know, and the security guard is saying that. So that is definitely there. And I would also say that we have to be careful to recognize that all people seeking safety, all, you know, have a right to do so. There are not certain humans that are more humans than other, right? And there's not, you know, and there's not this idea of a hierarchy of human that I think can be very problematic. In Winnipeg, you can specifically see it in terms of racism against Indigenous folks, and I would say also in terms of East African especially. That has been my experience in the 5.5 years being here, teaching here, working here, and raising children here.
Who is responsible for this oppression for Indigenous community and other folks? The government or the public, and what we can do?
We are all responsible. Yeah, I mean, there are government policies that entrench this. The Indian Act is inherently racist and colonialist and sexist, right? I mean, that is a government policy. But really, we as a society set the rules for how we treat others as a society, right? So as how we teach our children, how our schools teach, what gets represented in media, who is not represented in media, who is not speaking in media. All of this. So some of this is government policy, but some of this is also just our institutions and our social fabric. And we also have a responsibility, if we see something wrong, to change it. Not just to say it's wrong, but to listen to people about how to make it better.
How many years do we need to stop discrimination and to change the situation? Is it possible to stop discrimination for Indigenous communities and other folks?
Oh, I've seen changes in my own lifetime. I mean, for instance, the whole definition of marriage, right? The definition of marriage fundamentally, in my lifetime, went from being between one man and one woman to being between two people, two consenting adults who love each other. That was a change that took place in society that then affected a change in the law, right? And then affected changes in institutions. So, I mean, that has happened within my own lifetime. It doesn't mean that there's not still homophobia. It doesn't mean that there's not still discrimination against people in the LGBT, plus community. But that's something we could see tangibly that's changed. What I have seen in terms of the changes in policies with regards to Indigenous folks and listening to Indigenous people about what they need and what they want, that has absolutely changed within the past 5 years that I've been here. Even simple things like land acknowledgements. Even simple things in terms of the understanding of the Bear Clan, which started off because police were not responding well or responding at all in certain communities in Winnipeg, including my own of West Broadway, right? And so the Bear Clan came and was created as a response because the police were who are a government agency, were abdicating their responsibility. Now, actually, the Bear Clan is recognized as one of the first places to go if you are running into certain issues that could be safety concerns or folks who might need some help. Police refer people to the Bear Clan now, right? That's something that's changed even in my 5 years of being in Winnipeg.
So in 5 years, we will be even further.
Well, I hope so. I don't believe in inevitable progress. We as citizens, we as people, we as parents, we as students, we as workers, we as community members must hold each other accountable. Things don't inevitably get better. I mean, look at what's happened in Europe. Look what's happened in the United States. It's not better, right? That's what happens when we become complacent. It's also what happens when we become scared, though. People don't make good decisions when they're scared. People don't make good decisions when they're hungry. People don't make good decisions when they're desperate. So if we make sure that people are not hungry, if we make sure that people are feeling safe in their own skins and from one another, and if we make people, feel that they are included in society, that they are part of that society, then things will be better in 5 years.
So we first should take care about like homeless people, to build a safe place and to build rights for everyone.
Yeah, it's not just homeless people. I mean, have you looked at the cost of rent? Yeah. Right? Like the cost of rent is insane. It's gone on astronomically. The grocery store bills, it's gone astronomically. I'm so grateful for $10 a day daycare. I have both an infant and a preschooler. I was paying over $1,000 a month for daycare, and Manitoba was considered one of the cheapest places for daycare. And that was over $1,000 a month so that I could go and work. So it's not about taking care of the poor people. It's recognizing that we are all human. It's not charity, it's rights. And then we will be able to build together. If we look at the societies that don't have war and violence as much, everyone looks at the Nordic countries. Why? Because they have a strong social safety net. It's not that they don't have racism. There's a lot of racism. Some of the strongest neo-Nazis come out of Sweden, right? But they have a very strong social safety net. And then they also have the space to be able to counter things. They also have very strong media. So you have to do your job and keep us accountable.
What is the role of media in building equally society?
Ooh. Media is the fifth estate, right? It's supposed to be kind of keeping a watchdog on everything. Sometimes it's just too much about what's wrong. What's going on, what's scandal, what's wrong. All of that is very interesting. But I really feel like what media can do, what this program, for instance, does, is it provides opportunities to look at what can be right. And it's something, again, that I teach my students, that I say, I work on human rights. I don't just work on human rights violations, right? We can't just look at what's wrong. We have to also do, so what could be better? And what do we need to make it better in that sense? And that's something I think that media can do, is it could provide spaces and possibilities for exploring how things can be better, who is trying to make things better, and what are the ingredients that are needed in order to do that. What are the institutional changes? What are the legal changes? What are the tax changes, to be able to have a more just life or just society?
And just to wrap up, looking into 2023, what are the top 3 human rights issues of the future, and what steps might be taken to prevent them?
Okay, I wrote this down because three is
Sure.
hard, okay? Economic rights as human rights, right? Really recognizing that dental care, that child care, that housing, this is not charity. This is human rights. If we look at the International Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which Canada is a party to, these are basic human rights. So really keeping on that pressure, the economic rights as human rights. That's number 1. Number 2, rising nationalism worldwide, and including the United States and Canada too. Nationalism is very dangerous. Nationalism is often equated to a cancer, and it's true, because what does a cancer do? It takes the nutrients and it sucks it away, and then it leaves everything else to die and to atrophy. Nationalism is extraordinarily toxic. We need to recognize that as a human rights issue. That is also what affects immigration policy, refugee policy, et cetera. But we need to, so that's number 2. And then number 3, I would say reversing the safe third country agreement here in Canada. It was created at a time of political fear. It was created because of nationalism and fear after 9/11, Islamophobia after 9/11, this belief that the United States and Canada were both always going to be fair and equitable to those people seeking asylum, which was never the case, but was a political agreement. And this has drastic effects of what's happening right now in terms of safety for people. So those 3 things: economic rights as human rights, countering the rising nationalism worldwide and locally, and reversing the safe third country agreement here in Canada.
And what are your hopes for the Winnipeg and Canada overall in terms of respecting human rights when all this will be done?
I'm going to answer you with a story.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
My daughter's name is Mira. Okay? In our culture, we name after somebody who's passed away, so I knew her name had to begin with an M-I. But the other reason I chose her name as Mira is that in Spanish, Mira means look. It's a command form to look. In Macedonian, it means peace. In Russian and other related languages, it means world. In Albanian, it means good. I wanted my daughter to be able to tell people to look about what can be made so that we can have a more peaceful world and a better world. And her name encompasses all of that. That is what I think. That is my hope, is that my daughter will be able to do that, and that people will be able to listen and call that out for themselves.
And then we will have very healthy, hopeful society with the respecting all human beings.
And recognizing that when somebody calls out injustice, it's not a threat. It's actually a step to be able to build, right? It's an opportunity to build. When Indigenous people are saying, look, we've had unmarked graves here, we've known this, you've just never listened. And here's how we think it could be better. They're not threatening Canada. They're helping to heal Canada and to a better world. So that is my hope, is that we learn not just to talk, but to listen, and then to do the work, to have the dirt under our fingernails and do the work. That's why I moved here in Winnipeg. That's my hope. I want to be part of working.
You see a big future for the Winnipeg.
Oh, I have no doubt. Even though I miss the sushi in BC. And the mountains.
Okay, thank you so much, Shayna, for this great conversation, for sharing your knowledge. I hope our audience learned a lot from you.
Thank you, Yuliia, and I look forward to learning from everybody that I meet, and I truly mean that. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
And thank you, our audience, for joining us today. We hope you enjoy it. If you like the episode, please like, share, and subscribe to see our upcoming episodes.